Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In closing with a series of SQL videos, I'm going to go into the last video of Profiler, which is some of the best practices that are used for the SQL Profiler. Now, obviously, every DB has its own versions of what's considered best practice, but if you follow some of these, then you'll be fine. Now, everything you'll have to decide as to what considered best practice in your environment. But the ones that I'm recommended are usually followed. So go to your tools, go to SQL Profiler. Let's connect to the profiler. And the first thing is obviously the trace name. So you want to give it a good trace name, something that's descriptive. So let's just paste this here. And I'll just call detect indexes with database 2. Using the template, obviously if you've defined user-defined base templates, then you can use it, or you can use one of these templates. For our purposes, I'm going to use this standard. And then go to the events selection. And obviously, one thing you'll notice here that if I were to run this template, it's going to do all these events, which is fine for me. We always basically want store procedures and TSQLs. This you can uncheck if you wish for the security, if you want to filter events, but we'll leave it as default. That's close enough. The other obviously thing is question is, do we want to retrieve data for all these columns? Well, I certainly want this. You'll have to decide. If I'm not doing any performance issues for hardware, I don't need CPU writes at this point and reads, so I can uncheck those. And as you can see, unchecking them causes the background to go kind of gray in color. And that's fine, and I'll leave that. And if I go show column and check it, that's fine. Now, if I were to run again here, it's going to run, as I said, against the entire server and against the entire databases. So one thing you want to do is make sure you show columns and select the database name column. So make sure you detect that, otherwise, and once we uncheck it, there it is. Now, that's one of the practices, so make sure you do that. The next thing is column filter. So you want to click on column filter. Now that we've got database name, go select that, go like, and type in the database that you want the profile to run against. In this case, it's SQL. Now, when you run the SQL profiler, it will only run against this database rather than running against every database. So that's a great saving tool also in serving data. So make sure you do that also. Going back to general, question is, should you save it to a file or a table? As I have mentioned, that when you run the SQL profile, even with some filtering, it can collect a tremendous amount of data. And if you put it to a table, it's going to be create the table first and all the columns, and it can be taxing. Create it to a file first, and I'll just call it that, so that's fine. And then the other thing you want to do is change the maximum size to 5 megabytes. Most likely when you run the SQL profile, it's going to be for a few hours, unless you're doing a quick analysis, and then it's fine. But generally, I like to change this to at least 100 so I don't get increments of 5 megabyte files constantly. Leave the enable file rollover. The other thing is enable this trace to stop. Do this if you're going to do it for a few hours, then obviously set this for a few hours later. So if you accidentally stop, if you accidentally forget, then obviously it'll automatically stop. So that's another thing. And other than that, you can run it and save the file. Now, once you've done this, it's already saved to a file. So when you've run when you run it, you can either analyze it directly on a table or transfer it to an Excel sheet and do the analysis there. So those are some of the quick hints of how to use the SQL profiler and what are some of the best practices. The key thing in best practice is try to minimize the retrieval of data for exactly what you need. Don't do any less and don't do any more. And that's the key thing in understanding the profiler. So I'm just going to stop this now. So if you follow those simple guidelines, and then you'll do well in gathering all the necessary data rather than being superfluous. So I'm just going to close this. Yes, and that's it. So that's just a quick examples, and we already gone over it. The next video that I'm going to be talking about is the DTA, which is the Database Tuning Advisor. And we've already talked about that, where we need to collect a workload, which we have. So I'm going to show you what that does. So I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to go over it. There's not that much more to explain. Just continually test the SQL profiler yourself. look at the various events, get familiar with the events, and then you'll get a better understanding of what events are relevant and what are not, and you'll use in a kind of a daily, weekly, or a monthly basis. Only experience will tell you that. I can't show you that. If I showed you one by one, we'd be doing nothing but the SQL Profiler. So I'm going to leave it there and call it a quits here. So my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator. See you in the next video.